기자부대! I'm on the beat!
Hey everyone, today I'm going to be responding to some of your JoJo hot takes. JoJo has always been a series that leads to a lot of debate, and opinions from one JoJo fan to the next can vary greatly. So I asked my community to comment with their JoJo hot takes, and I actually received an overwhelming response. I thought this could be a fun idea to just see what my reaction is to what people have to say, and I think this can let me cover some little topics that I haven't really been able to cover in my other videos. Now this video will contain spoilers for each part of JoJo, but I'll be splitting up the topics part by part, so if you're at a certain part, that's your warning to stop there in case you get spoiled. First is a hot take for part 1, which I actually saw a lot when I asked. The idea here is that Phantom Blood is very underappreciated, and I agree with this. For whatever reason, Phantom Blood is seen by many as boring, and some say that it makes it very difficult for them to get into the series. Some even skip the first part altogether. On the contrary, I love Phantom Blood, and it's precisely what got me to love JoJo in the first place. I think part 1 is one of Araki's most tightly written stories, and pretty much perfectly represents JoJo's main theme of being a celebration of humanity. In particular, the first 2 volumes ending with Dio's defeat at the mansion are my favorite, and could have even been a standalone story if it ended there. But the story evolved even further with the introduction of Hamon and Zeppeli, which is something else I really love about it. Really, the idea of someone skipping part 1 is sort of ridiculous to me. For the anime, it's only 9 episodes, which when it comes to anime watching is honestly not that much. I also just don't see what someone is getting out of JoJo if they hated part 1. So much of the series is based on the ideas introduced here, and the duality between Jonathan and Dio is like the gold standard for everything that came after. Not to mention the story implications of skipping the origin of the series' most influential villain. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of people do still like Phantom Blood, but it does still rank on the lower end of JoJo parts with many, which is a shame. The recently released Phantom Blood musical is also a whole new factor in my love for this part, since it retold the story in a really brilliant way and showcased just how much it aligned with JoJo's theme. Next is one related to the power of Hamon in general. They say, I prefer calling it Ripple over Hamon. I'm honestly not sure why it's usually kept as Hamon in translations, but Spin is never called Kaiten. This is another good topic since this actually seems to be a big divide among fans. As you already know, I do still call it Hamon. However, I think the main reason it's referred to as Hamon in so many places is simply a coincidence. The anime subtitles chose to use Hamon, so that's what most people use. As for Spin, in that case the fan translation chose to use Spin instead of Kaiten, so that's why everyone calls it Spin. It's really not that deep. Now, I do still call it Ripple at times, particularly in videos where I want to stress the connection between Hamon and stands, with stands being written as Yu Hamon or Ghostly Ripple. But in casual conversation, I just stick to Hamon and it doesn't really matter that much. Another common one I saw was people saying they think part 2 is the worst part. Now, things like this honestly make me feel old, since back when I first got into JoJo, it was not like this at all. Back in 2014, when the Part 3 anime was new, Part 2 was actually one of the most well-liked parts. I'm honestly not even sure what the criticisms are here, since most people didn't elaborate. One I saw was that the part is meandering, however, I don't see that at all. I'd actually call Part 2 one of the more fast-paced stories in the series, and it jumps across a lot of locations around the world. So I'll say I disagree with this take. Next is another hot topic, which is the transition from Hamon to stands. Many said that they believed Hamon was the superior power system, or that it at least should have remained in the story. Now personally, while I love Hamon, I do believe it had reached its natural conclusion and that not much more could have been done with it. Araki has said that he tries to avoid falling into a typical shonen format where each enemy becomes arbitrarily more powerful until their strength starts to lose meaning. So with stands, Araki was able to get around this. Each stand user has an entirely unique ability, and it becomes even more interesting when different stands interact. This lets every fight feel new and have infinite possibilities. I simply don't think Hamon could have accomplished this. Now, for the idea that Hamon should have remained in the story, I agree and disagree. I do think it could have been cool to see another dual stand and Hamon user other than Joseph, but when you really think about it, I feel like that would just undercut a possibly interesting ability. I don't think there's much for Hamon to add to a stand that Joseph didn't already do with Hermit Purple, and it risks just having a character with a stand ability and Hamon at the same time without any interesting synergy. So overall, while I like Hamon, I stand by Araki's decision to move past it after part 2. This next one is kind of strange. They say, one of the things that isn't quite enjoyable for me is that sometimes Araki pulls something completely absurd for no reason, especially if it's a joke. There's a few cases like Dio's road roller or Stroheim's gun attached to his body, which makes it seem like the manga is improvised. Now this I just don't understand at all. I don't know if I have to point this out, but we are talking about a manga called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and being surprised that something strange happens in it is kind of funny. Also, isn't it sort of the intended effect of bizarre things to be strange? If they weren't, then they would have failed at being bizarre in the first place. Also, many examples he picks are just so ill-fitting for the point. Sure, I could see Dio's steamroller being random, but it isn't that out of place, it's more like it's surprising. And that's sort of the charm and why that move became so iconic. And for Stroheim, we're talking about a literal cyborg, so I don't see how him having a gun is strange of all things. Really, their examples are things that aren't particularly weird at all, so I don't know what the point is supposed to be. This next hot take says that rather than reading the Part 3 manga or watching the anime, that people should instead start with the Stardust Crusader OVAs. Their points are that it emphasizes the series' mystery and horror elements, which aren't there on a second watch, and that while it cuts things out, that'll just make the extra content in the other versions a pleasant surprise. Now, of course, I disagree with this entirely. I love the OVAs, but they are definitely not a replacement for the story of Part 3. The fact that the story is shortened is definitely its biggest weakness, since it undermines the main purpose of Part 3, which is to be this huge journey across the world. By only including a few stops on that path, it makes the journey not feel like how it should. Now for the surprise angle, I think that works equally in reverse. Rather than just cutting, the OVA also makes many changes to the actual content of the story itself. You'll actually be very surprised by what you see in the OVA if you already know the story, so I don't think their second point works at all. This next one deals with Jonathan's stand. They say Jonathan's stand is the world, because how do two people who have no relationship by blood have the same exact stand? And that exact stand hasn't been seen anywhere besides that bloodline, not to mention he's the one who activated stands in his family, and blood from his family amped up the world's abilities, but Jotaro just evolved it naturally. Now, beyond being kind of incomprehensible to read, there's a few problems with this. The first of which being that Jonathan's stand has been explicitly listed as Jonathan's stand by official media, so we know that it's his. But for their other points, they say that Dio and Jotaro can't have the same stand since they aren't related. But they seem to ignore the implications of that, which is that now Dio and Joseph have the same stand despite not being related, which makes even less sense, since Dio would never have a stand like Hermit Purple, which is related to Hamon. Really, the main thing they're missing here is that for all intents and purposes, Dio is related to Jotaro, since he has Jonathan's body. The body does try to reject Dio and emits the distress signal, but it is still his body, and he is undeniably connected to the Joestars through their psychic link. This next hot take is that the fan comic from Clamp isn't that bad. Now, if you aren't aware, this person is talking about Clamp in Wonderland, JoJo's Bizarre Married Life. This is a JoJo fan comic made by the mangaka group Clamp. They're quite well known for creating Cardcaptor Sakura and doing character designs for series like Code Geass. However, back in their early days, they made fan manga of other series. One of these was JoJo's Bizarre Married Life, a humorous yaoi story between Jotaro and Kakyoin, where Kakyoin lays an egg containing their gay love child, Jota Kujo. This is one of the common fan memes from the earlier JoJo fandom with how ridiculous the whole idea is. Now, I agree with this comment since I actually like Clamp in Wonderland. The story is intentionally hilarious, and I think it also gives a really interesting look into early JoJo fan content. The creators have even gone on to collaborate with Araki himself. I made a video going over the story and Clamp as a whole, so I recommend checking that out if you want to hear more. Now we get to part 4 with a question specifically dealing with the anime. This person says that the sky colors in part 4 look bad. They're of course referring to how in the part 4 adaptation the sky was primarily depicted as yellow instead of blue. Now, I disagree with this entirely. While I don't think the art direction of the part 4 anime is perfect, I do really think it benefited from having a unique style, and by being a bit different from the rest, I feel like it has a lot more staying power. The yellow sky honestly looks fantastic and establishes a nice mood for the town of Morioh. If you look through many of Araki's Part 4 illustrations, you'll see that yellow sky all over the place. So I think this was an essential part of the art style that I'm glad they translated here. Next is another anime one which I saw a few times, saying that Chase is a good opening. If you don't remember, Chase is the second opening for Part 4's anime. Now I feel like nowadays this isn't really a hot take anymore. I was watching Part 4 as it aired, and I do remember people not liking Chase. I myself also didn't like it, but I can't really remember the reason why. I think I was just a big fan of Crazy Noisy Bizarre Town, and as a fan of Coda's JoJo songs in particular, I found Chase disappointing. However, listening to it now, I really like it, and I think it fits the subject matter of that time in the story, so I agree that it is a good opening. This next one says, even though Part 4 is probably top 2 for me, Kira is incredibly overrated. How can you say that a sociopath with a hand fetish is a better villain than Dio Brando or others? For this one, I completely disagree, and I feel like they're really missing the point of Kira here. Oddly enough, they almost get it by pointing out that Kira is a very unorthodox character. Araki's intention with Kira was to avoid the typical shonen formula, as I mentioned before. Following the battle with Dio, he didn't want to just create another more powerful villain to take his place. So instead, he created Kira, a very different kind of villain who is more flawed and is physically weaker than Dio. But that's part of what makes Kira interesting. He's the first main villain in JoJo to just be a human. And the fact that it's possible for a human to be that dangerous contributes to how scary he is. But he's also a very relatable character with a well-defined motivation behind his actions. Personally, I believe that Dio is the greatest villain in the JoJo series, and I've made a video going over everything I love about him as a character and how he relates to the series' themes. But that's talking about Dio over the whole series. I think if I had to pick a villain just based on their merits in each individual part, I would have to go with Kira for just how much Araki nailed it for that one story. Another hot take I've seen over the years is that Kira's death was underwhelming. Of course, this is referring to the fact that Kira was ultimately killed by being run over by an ambulance rather than being directly finished off by the main characters. However, I think the ambulance was actually a genius way to end that character. Kira had been established as a character with a supernatural level of luck. He was directly blessed by fate with the perfect ability to murder people and erase all evidence of the crime. The characters even acknowledge that if they had caught Kira, they don't actually have evidence to convict him. Kira's luck helped him to avoid punishment all the way up to the Bites the Dust arc, where finally his ego got too big and it's through his own actions that his identity is revealed and his plan fails. So having Kira be finished off through sheer bad luck is the perfect ironic punishment for him, since only his own luck allowed him to get this far in the first place. For one more Part 4 take, this person says, Joseph faking his senility is the worst theory since Josuke saving himself. Now, I had actually forgotten that this was even a theory in the first place, but I agree completely. Basically, some people say that Joseph was faking being senile in Part 4 to avoid punishment from Suzy Q. They say that the proof of this is that his health seemed to improve after Part 4. However, we actually know the reason for his health improving. It says that this was after he started to take care of Shizuka. This made his mind active and that helped, which is true in real life as well. I simply don't see why someone would think Joseph is faking it, since I think that just goes completely against his character. Now for Part 5. This person says that no matter what he had done throughout the part, Diavolo's punishment was not justified. Now, while the punishment of Diavolo dying over and over again forever is pretty severe, I'd say out of all the characters in the series, he's one of the most deserving. We have to remember that this is a guy who tried to kill his own daughter and also allowed dealing drugs to children. He's a pretty bad dude, but more importantly, his punishment happened for a pretty specific reason. Like Kira, he was blessed with a stand, and that let him get away with practically anything. But Diavolo's constant avoidance of fate eventually caused Giorno to attain Requiem and become the only thing that could defeat him. Next is another topic that's been hotly debated, which is that the Sleeping Slaves arc is good. If you remember, Sleeping Slaves was the final arc of Part 5, depicting a flashback to Mista's encounter with the stand Rolling Stone. A lot of people feel like this arc is out of place or that it served no purpose, some going far enough to say that it ruined the ending of the part. Now in this case, I completely agree with the hot take, since I love this arc. Contrary to people saying it's pointless, I'd say it's actually one of the single most important moments in that story. That arc showed that Bucciarati was fated to die, and that with his stand, Scolipi was going to give him a peaceful death rather than having to suffer later. But we see that Mista is able to go to great lengths to save Bucciarati. After this, we see the shape of the stone change, showing that along with Bucciarati, Abbacchio and Narancia will die too. However, that isn't really supposed to be viewed as a bad thing. If Bucciarati had died here, he never would have met Giorno, meaning Pulpo wouldn't have been killed and that their group would not have been selected as the ones to protect Trish. Diavolo would have never been stopped and Trish would eventually be killed. Scolipi says that we're all slaves to fate, but after seeing Mista's resolve, he realizes that the path they're going to take will serve a greater purpose. And as we already know, this is true. Even though Abbacchio and Narancia died, they grew as people and finally felt like they fulfilled a purpose. Really, this arc acts as a perfect way to deliver the theme of Part 5. Araki said that he wanted to ask a question of how someone reckons with fate when they're born under bad circumstances. His answer is that instead of agonizing over things outside your control, you just continue living and trying to create a better future. Now we move on to Part 6, and this next one is yet another really contested topic. More or less the takes I saw were that Part 6 is underrated, and I agree. I would say that out of all the parts, Stone Ocean is the most divisive among English readers. There's a variety of reasons for this, some of which come down to just plain misogyny, but for most of the criticisms I've seen of the part, I've just never agreed with them. One I see a lot is that when you get to Part 6, the stand abilities are just too strange and complicated for their own good. Again, I disagree. I think the insane powers we see in Part 6 are some of its best features, and shows Araki pushing the stand battle formula to its absolute limits. This ties into what Araki said about his writing at the time, that he felt he had reached the pinnacle of what he could create, causing him to want to undergo a big change with Steel Ball Run. So in my view, Stone Ocean represents the best of what the original run of JoJo has to offer. Really, if you look at all the criticisms, it's hard to find ones that aren't just very surface level or stemming from some critical misreading of the plot and concepts of the series, which I think is a big problem among JoJo fans in general. This next one says that Dio is not an interesting antagonist since he has a very unclear motivation. They say that in Part 1 he just wanted to get rich and then conquer the world, which is just generic villain stuff. But then in Part 6 he suddenly wanted to bring about heaven and give everyone in the world happiness, conflicting with how he had no regard for people before. Now, if you remember about 20 seconds ago when I talked about the criticisms of Part 6, I mentioned how many come from just completely failing to understand what is going on. Well, this is one of those times, since here we just have a complete misreading of Dio and the Heaven Plan. For some reason, people seem to have this idea that Dio's plan is to benefit humanity by bringing them happiness by creating heaven. This is just totally wrong and is looking only at the surface level. Remember that the heaven we're talking about is a world where all people have become completely aware of their fates and are forced to live out their lives which they are powerless to change. Now, Pucci believed that this would cause humanity to evolve and reach a level of happiness through embracing fate. But that's Pucci we're talking about, who is taking that idea for himself and applying it to his very specific trauma. Now, of course, Pucci's idea is misguided in the first place and goes completely against the celebration of the human spirit that the good guys of the story represent. But people seem to erroneously apply Pucci's philosophy to Dio when they're actually quite different. Remember, Dio had absolutely no intention of losing to Jotaro in Part 3. Dio wanted to control the world, and he also wanted to force those under him to become aware of that fact and that they were completely powerless to stop him. That's a huge part of Dio's character, and somehow believing that he's trying to give humanity happiness with his plan is just a complete misreading. Now for our next hot take, the anime is better than the manga. I feel like this is an opinion a lot of people hold, but personally, I disagree. I just don't think the anime can reach the heights of the manga just by virtue of being an adaptation. Fundamentally, JoJo in manga form has a single creative vision and is the purest possible representation of JoJo. It's literally Araki's own thoughts going into every page. That's why I think no matter how good the adaptations are, they can't override the manga. Beyond that, I do think that each season of the adaptation so far has had some flaws, be it pacing or budget issues that drag it down. So for me, the manga is always going to be on top. Next we have one for the ending of Part 6. They say, I'm glad Giorno and Josuke didn't show up for the Pucci fight like in many fan interpretations. It would have been nice for Jolene to meet some of her family, but if anything, that would have caused more conflict. And I agree completely here. It would be nice to see Josuke and Giorno again, but their stories have already been told. From a writing standpoint, it simply wouldn't be helping the story to drag in more characters here, and the ending is much stronger being focused on our core group of characters. I also feel like this is just something Araki would never do. He made an ending for Josuke and Giorno that made sense as a conclusion for those characters. One of the things he said that really stands out to me is this statement from Araki about Part 4. He says that for him, Morioh exists in the world of eternity. He personally doesn't think about what might have happened to Josuke after Part 4, since in his mind, those characters simply remain that way forever. So I feel like him bringing Josuke back after that point would sort of shatter the nostalgic image of Morioh that Part 4 tried to create. Now we move on to Steel Ball Run. For the first one, this person says, if you are both a JoJo fan who shuns those who start at Steel Ball Run and a Doctor Who fan who recommends that people start at the 2005 series, you're a hypocrite. Now I'm not a Doctor Who fan, but I have to disagree here. For one, these things are just not really comparable. Doctor Who is a huge franchise with a variety of different creators, while JoJo is the expression of one man's vision and how it evolves over time is a very important part of that experience. And rather than just being a reboot, Steel Ball Run is an evolution of what came before and relies on years of context and development of JoJo's themes. And honestly, if I was a Doctor Who fan, then I probably wouldn't be telling people to start from a later installment. As someone who loves Star Trek and Kamen Rider, I heavily advocate for people starting with the original incarnations of those stories. So for JoJo, I'm the same way. For Part 7 in general, I got some people saying that Steel Ball Run is overhyped by fans. Now, I'm sure everyone watching is aware that Part 7 is pretty much unanimously liked by JoJo fans. Personally, it is my favorite story that Araki has done, but I do actually agree that people blow it way out of proportion to a degree that it makes some people's expectations too high. I don't think it's a problem of just overpraising the part though. I think that talking about your love for the story is fine, and I certainly do the same. I think the problem comes from people bringing down the other parts by comparison or dismissing the rest of JoJo up to that point as being not as good. This also contributes to a lot of pressure on people reading or watching JoJo to rush through and get to Part 7. I really don't like this, since I feel like people should take their time to enjoy each part, and letting someone else's enjoyment of a part influence how you read JoJo is only going to hamper your ability to form your own opinion. Now this next hot take is one I've really looked forward to covering on the channel at some point. For this one, I really just have to read it so you understand what's being said here. This one says, Funny Valentine is the best JoJo main villain. He has the most reasonable reasons for his actions out of most if not all other main villains. He acts selflessly for his own country, trying to guarantee prosperity for his own people and not being overall an evil guy. Then he goes on to just list out why the other JoJo villains are evil in comparison to him. So basically the main conceit here is that they're saying that Valentine is selfless and not evil. Now I've seen this as a super widespread belief for a lot of JoJo fans, and honestly I find it totally insane. Valentine is absolutely an evil guy, and his goal is not something good. What Valentine essentially plans to do is repel all negative fortune from the United States, turning it into a utopia while cursing the rest of the world. And he doesn't care how many people he has to kill or brutalize along the way, as we see throughout the story. He's also just morally despicable in general, with one of the most notable moments being his attempted sexual assault of Lucy. Really, I feel like some fans just take everything Valentine says totally at face value and get swept up in his charisma. Now, I agree that Valentine is a charismatic character, which is sort of the point. He's literally the president of the United States. He's a super idealistic character, and that's part of what makes him a good villain, and I do consider him one of Araki's best. But the idea that he is a morally good character, when Araki himself has even said that he is, and I quote, unquestionably and unforgivably evil, is just ridiculous. Now, this comment itself actually has a bit more to go over. For one, he says Pucci's goal is good, but it's only his killing of the main characters that makes him evil. But I already went over why that idea is insane earlier. But I actually left out a tiny bit more, which is that this guy didn't even read Part 7 to begin with. So I think it's kind of telling that the opinion on Valentine from someone who hasn't read the manga is almost indistinguishable from some of the JoJo fans who have read it out there. Finally, we have a question for Parts 8 and 9. They say nobody from Part 8 should show up in Part 9. If it's a flashback like with Johnny in Part 8, it's fine, but they shouldn't actually appear in the story. Now for this, I do understand the perspective of what this person is saying. Like with Giorno or Josuke in Part 6, I do think inserting old characters where they don't belong would be detrimental. But JoJo has gracefully used old characters in previous parts, and I don't see why that can't be the case for Part 9. I personally do believe that Josuke or the others will make an appearance, mostly because the end of Part 8 specifically hinted at more in the future. We're far too early in the story to know for sure, but I do expect something to cross over since Araki has planned the basic structure of Part 7 to 9 all the way back in 2004. I think if he was thinking that far ahead, then there's going to be some kind of unified idea that the 3 stories will work towards. And with Part 9 being set relatively close to JoJolion time-wise, I do foresee something showing up. That's every hot take for now. When I made my community post announcing this video idea, I was actually surprised at the huge response I got. People seem to really like it since I ended up with a ton of topics. I actually cut the planned amount of topics in this video short since I spoke on each one longer than expected, so I definitely plan on making another one of these with the topics left over, and if there's anything you'd like to see me respond to in another video, feel free to comment it below. Also, just let me know how you feel about this new style of video since I had a really fun time making it and it might become a new mainstay of the channel. If you want to keep up with new videos, make sure to subscribe and click the bell. You can also join the Hamon Discord to be notified on any new uploads or important JoJo news. Finally, I'd appreciate it if you help support the channel on Patreon. There you can receive Discord perks and submit Patron questions. This video's question comes from Gold. They ask, what are my favorite songs in the Phantom Blood musical? Now, there's 33 total songs in the show, so I won't rank them all here, although that might actually be an idea for a full video down the line, so I'll just quickly go over some of my favorites. The opening sequence Eternal Voice I really enjoy, depicting the Aztec sacrifice, and I've rewatched it a ton from how well they portray that scene which the anime skipped over. I also really like Erina's solo song Stars Drawn Together after Jonathan joins Zeppeli, which is just one part of the nice additions to Erina's characterization in the show. Obviously Dio's big song Dio's World is one of my favorites since Mamoru Miyano completely owns that role. And I think the song that best represents the main theme of the show would be Golden Spirit, first sung by George and later Jonathan about believing in humanity. But I'd say my favorite song, which is also the first one I ever saw from the show, is Resolve of the Ripple, which shows the first meeting of Jonathan and Zeppeli and the demonstration of Hamon. Everything about this one is perfect for me, especially the use of the Hamon backup dancers and the frog. The musical is one of my favorite things to come from JoJo in recent years, so I'm actually looking forward to making a couple big videos covering it later this year. If you want to submit a question, you can become a patron at any tier and submit it in the community chat or over Patreon DMs. I try to answer one question at the end of each video, but I have very few to choose from, so I hope that if you're a patron, you add as many as you want, since it is very likely to be answered. The questions also don't have to be related to JoJo either, so I encourage you to ask whatever you want. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Sloth Dog, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Almighty Quarth, Gatlin Grove, Lime Jinjo, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Great Riek, Carmo Trina, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Big T, C Manga, Minty, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Jolene, Monticelli, Zenkai, Royal Slush, and Lyra.